it is also the first level who is aware of the power and the prison or bondage of language. We just use it, we're really not aware what it does, but every time, and here I wanted to show you something that has to do with my craft. This is, imagine this is the undivided phenomenological continuum. There's nothing yet. Before God created, before Genesis, before anything was differentiated, there was one continuous thing. Then we make one distinction. And what do we get? What do I have here? Two hearts. And what else do I have? I have a whole, and I have a negative and a positive, and I have the background. What happens if I change any one of these? All three change. The whole changes, the positive changes, the negative changes, and the context from which I cut this out, from which I define that out. If you think of the word analytical, means actually cutting out, cutting apart into pieces. When you think of the words we used, definition is a Latin word for definire, putting a fines is a boundary around it. All the words we have for that, demarcation, outlining, have to do with putting a boundary around something that initially did not have it. And it's also where, of course, when you go to later stages and when you read the ancients, the whole idea of dualism and splitting is exactly that. When for the first time you say, from this undivided continuum, I'm going to pick out this pattern and call it this. The idea that growth has to do with differentiation in the personal realm, greater and greater differentiation progressively, so finer and finer distinctions, more and more words. For instance, if you think of a sentiment like sad, how many words do we have for very subtly indicating what sort of sadness we have? In general, we can say the more differentiated a person, or the other way around, the later the stage, the more distinctions a person can make. And again, the more choice there is around that. And eventually there's also choice in reinterpreting what you named. And by saying this is arbitrary, this name, I can name it something else. And that's both a new freedom and a new burden. Because again, another level of security is taken away. Before we agreed that perhaps different cultures have different interpretation of things, but there's still, we can sort of agree, we can come to say, well, this is this or this is that. Here you say there's not even that certainty. Language is much, much more fluid. Things change. If I define one thing just a tiny bit differently, I have a different thing and a different context. You know that in scientific writing. One of the first steps of, that's not the right expression, order of business is to define your concepts for that precise reason, because otherwise we can't even talk to each other, because you may mean something else with the same word than I mean, and we're talking cross purposes. But the magician is aware of the artificiality of those distinctions. That is new. The other thing is, of course, the polar opposite, that you can't actually talk about light without dark, that you can actually not talk about good without bad, that they're always together. They are the splits, the dualistic splits that we make, and they're always attached to value. And in general, human beings tend to favor the good side, the pleasure, the one side over the other. And with later stage development, transpersonal, there comes a capacity to hold them both consciously as just two sides of the similar same thing. Not to be valued more than the other because they codify each other. And this sort of stuff is what gets me really excited, and then I'm often aware that other people couldn't care less. I don't know, it makes me feel alive. It's to me, I guess I can say it this way. You know, Loewinger created her theory to a certain point, and they became so iffy that in the newer manuals, in the 96 manuals, they even didn't describe the higher stages anymore. They just don't have evidence. I'm now at the place where I don't have evidence, and that's exciting to me, the unknown, the real ambiguity that exists there, the real aliveness in when you don't know. I don't know whether some of you can resonate with that. That's when I feel most alive, not when I know. First, I'm suspicious when I think I know. And then I realize that the vitality that, at least for me, comes from when I don't know, when there's sort of things to look at, and I'm using all I have to try and get a sense of it and tell a story about it, knowing full well that it's just a story. But that's exciting. And then we have one more transformation, and this one, it's not just distancing from one's own, the deconstruction from greater and greater sense of things are constructed and things aren't what they seem to be. This time it's a total, what I would call a paradigm shift. And I was in my early 20s when we first landed on the moon. And I guess they saw it actually, there's some images yesterday, and for the first time somebody was able to step outside and see the whole world as an outside, as an object. And before that, up to the magician stage, we're still earthbound, we're still in the personal realm. The ego, the self, is still the one that always calls the shots. It tries not to. It becomes aware of itself and tries terribly hard to say, okay, detach, wonderful concept. I will really, really work on detachment. Well, what's that? A great attachment to detachment. The paradoxes that come with that level are also something that increase the kind of suffering and difficulty of being at that level, the constant awareness of the what I call existential paradoxes that we live in. We can't help to, because of course we desire to transcend. But the very desire is at the same time enforcing the attachment. So that's a place that takes quite a bit of courage to live in. And then there is this transcendence where there's a real shift away from the ego to being just the witness and the watcher of all of this. And it doesn't deny the whole system below. But it's no longer the only perspective you can take from the star, from the ego side. But now you can stand outside and enter that when it's useful. Or not, or stay in the master or in the witness stance if that's the most functional you want to do. And even later you can keep them all at once. You can keep the witness operating while you're doing your daily chores, while you're using your ego for certain purposes. And you're awake to that, you're aware of that. So in other words, we can say ego development is a theory of increasing self-awareness. That's really its focus. And because everything practically that happens in terms of development in the personal realm is based on language or is mediated by language, the lower left. So we have these two together. They're really not, one cannot imagine one without the other. Even so, the theory focuses on the upper left. The fact that we are social beings and couldn't live without other people, that's part of the constant interchange. I want to just remind you of that. And all the other quadrants, of course, have the influences too. The biological, just the physical, who we are, makes a difference on how we see the world. The structures, the history, the personal history, the historical background, the zeitgeist we live in, all influence what we can see, what stories we can tell, and how we are. These we discussed already. The increasing differentiation and the notion that polar opposites are two sides of the same coin, and that evaluation is part of what human beings continuously do, continuously favor one side over the other, or most of the time, and that's a trap, and that leads to suffering. It's not the things per se that lead to suffering, it's valuing one of the sides of the two sides more than the other. And with increasing development, there's a greater capacity to just hold them both and just look at them and say, interesting, look at this polarity, look at this tension, look at this polar opposite and paradox as well.